The courtroom doors opened with that heavy wooden sound that seems to echo with the weight of every decision that's ever been made inside those walls, and as we filed in behind Marcus and his attorney, I caught sight of something that made my pulse quicken in a way my family couldn't possibly understand. There, in the third row on the prosecution side, sat three men in dress blue uniforms, their posture so perfectly straight it looked like they'd been carved from stone. Their chests decorated with ribbons that told stories of courage and sacrifice in places most people only see on maps. Colonel Martinez was there, the man who debriefed me after my last mission, his weathered face impassive as he watched our family take our seats on the opposite side of the courtroom. Next to him sat Sergeant Major Williams, whose recommendation had gotten me into the program that changed my life, and Captain Rodriguez, who'd been my team leader during operations that officially never happened in countries we were never supposed to visit. My mother noticed them too, her eyes lingering on their uniforms with the kind of respectful curiosity that civilians always show toward military personnel in formal dress. She probably assumed they were witnesses in some other case, maybe waiting for their turn to testify about something completely unrelated to Marcus's situation. She'd never asked about my own brief stint in the military, the 6 months I'd supposedly spent in basic training before washing out and coming home with vague stories about not being cut out for military life. That story had become part of the family mythology about my inability to stick with anything, another example of how I'd started something promising only to quit when it got difficult. The truth was that I'd never washed out of anything. The truth was that those 6 months had been the beginning of 8 years of the most demanding, dangerous, and purposeful work I'd ever imagined possible. But that truth lived in classified files and sealed records, in places where curious family members could never access it, protected by security protocols that existed precisely because the work we did required absolute secrecy from everyone, including the people who loved us most. It had started with a recruiter who wasn't really a recruiter, a conversation that began as career counseling and ended with psychological evaluations and background checks that went deeper than anything I'd experienced before. They'd approached me during my junior year of college, when I was majoring in international relations and Arabic studies. When my professors were starting to notice that I had an unusual aptitude for pattern recognition and an almost intuitive understanding of how different cultures approached conflict and negotiation. The man who called himself Mr. Johnson had explained that there were opportunities for someone with my skills and interests, positions that would allow me to serve my country in ways that went beyond traditional military roles. The selection process had taken months, a series of tests and interviews that seemed designed to probe every aspect of my character and capabilities. They wanted to know how I handled stress, how I processed complex information under pressure, how I maintained operational security when people I cared about were asking questions I couldn't answer. They put me through scenarios that tested my ability to maintain cover stories, to live double lives without the deception eating away at my sense of self, to make decisions that prioritized mission success over personal comfort or family harmony. When I finally received my orders, they came with a cover story that my family would find perfectly believable. I was enlisting in the Army, going to basic training like thousands of other young men who needed direction and discipline in their lives. My parents were proud but not surprised, supportive of what they saw as my first real attempt to get serious about my future. They'd driven me to the airport, hugged me goodbye, and promised to write letters and send care packages while I learned to be a soldier. What they didn't know was that after the first month of legitimate basic training, I'd been quietly transferred to a program that didn't officially exist. Inducted into a world where my classmates were fluent in languages most people had never heard of and where our training exercises took place in mock villages that perfectly replicated towns in countries our government publicly claimed to have no interest in. We learned to blend into populations that would kill us if they discovered who we really were, to gather intelligence that would never be attributed to American sources, to eliminate threats that could never be acknowledged through official diplomatic or military channels. The training had been unlike anything I could have imagined, more comprehensive and intense than anything portrayed in movies or books about special operations. We learned to become different people, to inhabit cover identities so thoroughly that we could pass polygraph tests while lying about our own names. We studied regional dialects until we could pass for locals in a dozen different countries, memorized cultural practices and religious observances that would allow us to disappear into communities where a single mistake could cost lives and compromise operations. But beyond the technical skills, they taught us something harder to quantify, a kind of psychological discipline that allowed us to maintain our real selves while living as someone else for months at a time. They showed us how to love our families while lying to them every day, how to maintain relationships built on deception without losing our capacity for genuine emotion, how to serve our country by sacrificing the normal connections that make life meaningful for most people. My first deployment had lasted 8 months, though my family believed I was stationed at Fort Bragg learning communications equipment and taking correspondence courses to finish my degree. In reality, I was in a country whose name I still can't write in any document that isn't classified, working with a team of analysts and operators to track financial networks that funded terrorism across 3 continents. We lived in safe houses that looked like ordinary apartments, drove cars that could have belonged to any young professional in that city, and maintained cover identities that placed us as everything from graduate students to small business owners. The work was painstaking and often tedious, long hours of surveillance and data collection punctuated by moments of genuine danger when our targets began to suspect they were being watched. We identified funding sources, tracked money transfers, and documented relationships between seemingly legitimate businesses and organizations that used those funds to purchase weapons and plan attacks against civilian populations. Every piece of information we gathered was analyzed and cross-referenced with intelligence from other operations, building a comprehensive picture of networks that spanned multiple countries and involved hundreds of individuals. When I came home after that first deployment, my family noticed that I seemed more focused and mature, more purposeful in a way they attributed to military discipline and the responsibility of serving my country. They were proud of the man I'd become, pleased that the structure and challenges of military life had helped me find direction and confidence. What they couldn't see was that I'd spent 8 months living with the constant awareness that discovery meant death, that I'd developed skills and knowledge that set me apart from every civilian I'd ever known, that I'd become someone who could never fully share his experiences with the people he loved most. The second deployment had taken me to Central Asia, where I'd spent 10 months working with local contacts to identify supply routes used by organizations that smuggled weapons and personnel across borders that existed more on maps than in the mountainous terrain where we operated. This time my cover story involved a medical discharge for a training injury, a convenient explanation for why I was home earlier than expected and why I seemed reluctant to discuss my military service in detail. My family had accepted this story with the mixture of sympathy and disappointment that seemed to characterize their responses to most of my life choices. They were sorry that I'd been injured, but not entirely surprised that my military career had ended in something other than distinguished service. The medical discharge became another entry in the narrative they'd constructed about my inability to see things through, my pattern of starting strong only to encounter obstacles that prevented me from achieving the success they'd hoped for. Over the years, the deployments had continued, each one requiring increasingly elaborate cover stories to explain my absences and the changes they produced in my personality and perspective. I'd worked in Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, sometimes for months at a time, always returning with new skills and knowledge that I couldn't share with anyone outside the small community of people who did the same kind of work. I learned to speak languages that weren't offered in any university, developed expertise in subjects that didn't appear in any academic curriculum, and formed friendships with people whose real names I would never know. The hardest part wasn't the danger or the isolation, though both of those took their toll over time. The hardest part was coming home to family dinners where my successful brother talked about his latest business deals while I nodded along and pretended that my own work involved nothing more challenging than whatever temporary job I was supposedly working at the moment. It was watching my parents worry about my future while I sat on information that could prevent terrorist attacks and save thousands of lives, Knowing that I could never explain why their concerns about my career prospects seemed so trivial compared to the work I was actually doing. Marcus had always been curious about my employment gaps and vague explanations, but his questions had intensified after he'd started working with the defense contractor. He wanted to know about security clearances I'd supposedly applied for, background checks that should have been conducted for positions I claimed to have held, references that never seemed to pan out when employers tried to verify my work history. At first, I'd assumed his interest was genuine, that he was trying to help me navigate the bureaucracy involved in getting cleared for defense work. But as his questions became more specific and his knowledge of security procedures more detailed than someone in his position should have possessed, I'd begun to realize that his curiosity wasn't entirely innocent. He was probing for information about classified programs, fishing for details about operations and personnel that were far outside his area of legitimate access. The brother who'd always dismissed my career struggles was suddenly very interested in the specifics of work I'd supposedly never been able to get, clearances I'd supposedly never been able to obtain. When the counterintelligence investigation had begun, I'd been one of the first people briefed about Marcus's activities. Sitting in that secure conference room, listening to analysts explain how my own brother had been systematically violating his security obligations and attempting to access information about programs he had no need to know about, had been one of the most difficult moments of my career. They'd shown me phone records and computer logs, surveillance footage, and financial documents that painted a picture of someone who'd used his legitimate access as a stepping stone to material he was never authorized to see. The most damaging evidence involved his attempts to identify personnel involved in classified operations, his systematic efforts to match cover identities with real names and operational histories. He'd been building profiles of operators like me, trying to piece together information about programs that were supposed to remain completely compartmentalized from his area of work. When they'd shown me the files he'd compiled, I'd recognized several of my colleagues, people whose safety depended on their ability to maintain cover identities that my brother had been methodically attempting to compromise. The investigation had revealed that Marcus wasn't working alone, that he'd been sharing information with foreign contacts who had no business receiving any data about American defense operations, classified or otherwise. They'd recorded conversations where he discussed operational details that could only have come from highly restricted sources, where he'd provided analysis of intelligence that was supposed to be known only to people with specific authorizations. He'd been treating state secrets like insider trading information, valuable commodities that could be exchanged for financial and professional advantages. Watching him prepare for trial, seeing him construct his defense around claims of innocence and misunderstanding, had been almost as difficult as learning about his crimes in the first place. He genuinely seemed to believe that his intentions mattered more than his actions, that his analytical skills and financial expertise justified his access to information that was restricted for reasons he either didn't understand or chose to ignore. He'd convinced himself that the rules didn't apply to someone with his intelligence and credentials, that security protocols were bureaucratic obstacles rather than essential protections for people whose lives depended on operational security. The prosecution team had been thorough in their preparation, building a case that would demonstrate not just what Marcus had done, but why those actions constituted such a serious threat to national security. They'd documented every unauthorized access, every conversation with foreign contacts, every attempt to identify personnel and operations that were supposed to remain classified. They'd prepared exhibits that would show the jury exactly how much damage his activities could have caused, how many lives had been put at risk by his casual disregard for security procedures. But they'd also prepared something that would be even more devastating to Marcus's defense, something that would demonstrate just how wrong our family's assumptions about both of their sons had been. They'd arranged for testimony that would reveal not just the extent of Marcus's crimes, but the reality of my own service, the 8 years of operations and achievements that my family had never suspected and my brother had unknowingly tried to compromise. As the judge called the court to order and the prosecution began their opening statement, I could see Marcus scanning the courtroom with the confident expression of someone who still believed he could control the narrative. He nodded to our parents in the gallery, adjusted his tie with the practiced gesture of someone accustomed to being the most impressive person in any room, and whispered something to his attorney that made her smile reassuringly. What he didn't notice was the way Colonel Martinez was watching him, the careful attention that Sergeant Major Williams was paying to every word of the prosecution's opening remarks. The subtle communication between the uniformed men in the gallery, who represented a world that Marcus had tried to penetrate but never truly understood. They were here to ensure that justice was served, to see that someone who'd betrayed their trust and endangered their colleagues faced appropriate consequences for his actions. The prosecutor's voice was steady and professional as she outlined the charges against Marcus, explaining to the jury how a man with legitimate access to classified information had systematically exceeded his authorization and shared restricted material with foreign contacts. She described a pattern of behavior that demonstrated clear intent to commit espionage, a deliberate effort to profit from information that belonged to the American people and existed to protect American interests. As she spoke, I could see our parents struggling to process the technical details of security violations and classified access levels, their faces reflecting the confusion of people who'd never had to think about operational security or the compartmentalization of sensitive information. They were hearing about a version of their son that didn't match the successful businessman they'd always known, learning about crimes that seemed almost incomprehensible given their understanding of Marcus's character and motivations. The first witness was an FBI agent who'd led the investigation, a woman whose testimony methodically established the timeline of Marcus's unauthorized activities and his contacts with foreign nationals who'd paid him for information about American defense capabilities. She spoke clearly and without emotion, presenting evidence that painted a picture of systematic betrayal that had continued for more than 2 years before his arrest. Marcus's attorney objected frequently during this testimony, challenging the admissibility of evidence and the interpretation of activities that she claimed could be explained by legitimate analytical work rather than criminal intent. She was skilled and aggressive, exactly the kind of advocate that someone facing serious federal charges needed. But her objections couldn't change the fundamental facts of what her client had done or the documentation that supported the prosecution's case. The second witness was a counterintelligence analyst who explained the potential damage that Marcus's activities could have caused, the operational security breaches that his access to classified information represented. This testimony was more technical, involving discussions of security protocols and damage assessments that required the jury to understand concepts that most civilians never encounter. The analyst was patient and thorough, using charts and diagrams to illustrate how information that seemed harmless in isolation could become dangerous when combined with other data or shared with hostile intelligence services. It was during this testimony that Marcus first seemed to understand the seriousness of his situation, the reality that his actions were being treated not as white-collar violations, but as threats to national security. His confident demeanor began to crack slightly, his whispered conferences with his attorney becoming more urgent and animated as the prosecution built their case piece by methodical piece. The third witness was someone Marcus didn't recognize, a soft-spoken man in civilian clothes who identified himself as a program manager for classified operations that fell under the defense contractor where Marcus had worked. His testimony revealed that Marcus had been attempting to access information about programs that were completely unrelated to his legitimate responsibilities, that he'd been using his security clearance to investigate operations that he had no business knowing about. This witness's testimony was heavily redacted, with frequent sidebar conferences as the judge determined what information could be shared in open court without compromising ongoing operations. But even the sanitized version that the jury heard was damaging enough, establishing that Marcus had been conducting unauthorized research into classified programs and attempting to identify personnel involved in sensitive operations. As the morning progressed and witness after witness testified about different aspects of Marcus's crimes, I could see our parents' faith in their golden child beginning to waver. The evidence was too comprehensive, too well documented, and too clearly presented for them to maintain their belief that this was all a misunderstanding or persecution of an innocent man. They were learning that their successful son had been living a double life, that his intelligence and analytical skills had been turned toward criminal purposes that endangered people they would never meet, but who served their country in ways they could never fully understand. The prosecutor stood and announced her next witness with the kind of measured formality that suggested something significant was about to happen, her voice carrying across the courtroom as she called my name and asked me to come forward to be sworn in. I could feel the shock ripple through my family like a physical force, my mother's sharp intake of breath audible even from several rows behind me. My father's confused whisper asking someone to explain why I was walking toward the witness stand instead of sitting in the gallery with them. Marcus turned in his chair so quickly that his attorney had to put a restraining hand on his arm, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like panic as he watched his disappointing younger brother approach the bench, where witnesses swear to tell the truth about matters of national importance. The bailiff held out the Bible with the same professional courtesy he'd shown every other witness, but there was something different in his demeanor, a subtle shift in posture that suggested he knew exactly who I was and what my testimony was going to reveal. As I placed my left hand on the leather binding and raised my right hand, I could feel the weight of 8 years of secrecy pressing against my chest. The accumulated burden of every lie I'd told and every truth I'd been forced to withhold from the people who shared my blood but not my clearance level. The prosecutor approached the witness stand with a folder that I knew contained the declassified portions of my service record, the carefully sanitized version of my career that could be shared in open court without compromising ongoing operations or exposing methods that needed to remain classified. She began with basic questions about my identity and background, establishing for the jury that I was indeed Marcus's younger brother, the family member they'd been hearing about as an example of someone who'd never been able to maintain steady employment or achieve the kind of success that Marcus had built for himself. When she asked about my military service, I could see Marcus leaning forward in his chair, probably expecting me to confirm the story about washing out of basic training that had become part of our family's mythology about my failures and false starts. Instead, I looked direct. At the jury and explained that I'd served for 8 years in specialized units that conducted classified operations in support of national security objectives, that my service record had been deliberately obscured to protect operational security and the safety of personnel involved in sensitive missions. The courtroom fell silent in a way that seemed to stretch beyond the normal quiet of people listening to testimony, a profound stillness that suggested everyone present understood they were hearing something extraordinary. My mother made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, while my father sat frozen in his seat like someone who'd just realized that everything he thought he knew about his family was wrong. Marcus stared at me with an expression that mixed disbelief with dawning horror as he began to understand that his attempts to access classified information hadn't been abstract violations of bureaucratic rules, but direct threats to his own brother's safety and the security of operations I'd risked my life to complete. The prosecutor asked me to describe my current assignment, and I explained that I worked as a liaison between special operations units and intelligence agencies, that my job involved coordinating information sharing and operational support for missions that required extensive background knowledge and cultural expertise. This was the sanitized version of work that actually involved debriefing operators returning from classified missions, analyzing intelligence gathered in the field, and helping to plan operations in regions where I'd previously served undercover. When she asked about my security clearance level, I watched Marcus's face go completely white as I explained that I held one of the highest classifications available to operational personnel, that my clearance had been continuously updated and renewed based on my ongoing value to programs that couldn't be discussed in detail in an open courtroom. The golden child who'd been so proud of his own clearance, who'd treated his access to classified information as a mark of his intelligence and importance, was learning that his failure of a brother had been entrusted with secrets that went far beyond anything he'd ever been authorized to see. The most devastating moment came when the prosecutor asked me to identify exhibits that showed attempts to access information about my cover identities and operational history, documents that Marcus had compiled in his systematic effort to identify personnel involved in classified programs. Looking at those files, seeing my real name connected to cover identities that were supposed to remain completely compartmentalized was like watching someone dig up graves that were supposed to stay buried forever. I explained to the jury that these documents represented direct threats to operational security, that Marcus's attempts to identify operators like me could have resulted in the exposure of ongoing missions and the deaths of American personnel working in hostile environments. Each unauthorized access he'd made, each file he'd copied and analyzed, had put lives at risk in ways that he either didn't understand or didn't care about as long as the information had value to the foreign contacts who were paying him for classified material. When the prosecutor asked about the potential consequences of these security breaches, I had to explain concepts that most civilians never have to consider. The domino effect that begins when operational security is compromised and spreads to endanger entire networks of assets and operations. I described how the exposure of a single operator's identity could lead to the identification of contacts and safe houses, how information that seemed harmless in isolation could be combined with other intelligence to compromise missions that had taken years to develop and implement. Marcus's attorney objected repeatedly during this testimony, claiming that I was speculating about hypothetical damage rather than describing actual harm that had occurred. But the prosecutor was prepared for these objections, producing evidence that showed how information Marcus had shared with foreign contacts had already begun to impact ongoing operations, how intelligence services hostile to American interests had started adjusting their security procedures based on classified material that had originated from his unauthorized access. The judge allowed me to explain that several operations had been aborted or modified because of security concerns related to Marcus's activities, that assets had been relocated and cover identities had been burned because intelligence analysts couldn't determine how much classified information had been compromised. Lives had been disrupted and missions had been lost because someone with legitimate access had decided that his financial interests were more important than the safety of people who dedicated their lives to serving their country. During cross-examination, Marcus's attorney tried to suggest that my testimony was motivated by family jealousy or professional rivalry, that I was exaggerating the significance of her client's actions because I resented his success and wanted to see him punished. She painted me as the bitter younger brother who'd finally found a way to get revenge against the golden child who'd always overshadowed me, someone whose accusations couldn't be trusted because they came from a place of personal animosity rather than professional obligation. But her strategy backfired when she asked about my own achievements and recognition, apparently expecting me to admit that my military service had been undistinguished and unremarkable. Instead, I was able to describe commendations and awards that had been classified until that morning, honors that recognized exceptional service in operations that had prevented terrorist attacks and saved civilian lives. The prosecutor had worked with military authorities to declassify enough of my service record to demonstrate that whatever personal feelings I might have toward my brother, my testimony was coming from someone with impeccable credentials and unquestionable loyalty to American interests. The turning point came when the prosecutor called her final witness, Colonel Martinez, stepping forward with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades leading men and women in situations where leadership meant the difference between life and death. He identified himself as my former commanding officer and explained that he was testifying with special authorization from the Department of Defense to provide context for my service record and the significance of the security breaches that Marcus had committed. Colonel Martinez explained that I'd been selected for classified operations based on exceptional performance and demonstrated reliability under extreme stress, that I'd been entrusted with information and responsibilities that were reserved for the most capable and trustworthy personnel in the special operations community. He described missions where I'd risked my life to gather intelligence that had prevented attacks against American civilians, operations where my cultural knowledge and language skills had been essential to achieving objectives that protected national security. When the prosecutor asked about the impact of Marcus's security violations, Colonel Martinez's voice took on a gravity that seemed to fill the entire courtroom as he explained that the unauthorized access to classified information about special operations personnel constituted one of the most serious breaches of security his command had encountered in more than 20 years of conducting classified missions. He described how Marcus's activities had forced the reassignment of operators, the cancellation of missions, and the implementation of new security protocols that would affect operations for years to come. The most powerful moment came when Colonel Martinez turned to address the jury directly, his weathered face reflecting the accumulated weight of decades spent protecting American interests in places where failure meant death. He explained that the young man they saw at the prosecution table wasn't just a witness in a criminal case, but someone who'd repeatedly placed himself in harm's way to protect the freedom and security that Americans took for granted. Someone whose service had earned the respect and gratitude of commanders who'd worked with the finest soldiers America had ever produced. Then Colonel Martinez did something that no one in my family expected, something that transformed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom in a single gesture that spoke louder than any testimony could have. He stood at attention, his posture reflecting 30 years of military discipline and tradition, and rendered a perfect salute that acknowledged not just my rank, but the valor and sacrifice that my service had represented. Sergeant Major Williams and Captain Rodriguez immediately followed his example, rising from their seats and saluting with the precision and respect that special operations personnel reserve for brothers who've proven themselves in combat and classified missions. The silence that followed was profound and complete, broken only by my mother's quiet sobbing as she finally understood that the son she'd worried about for years, the brother who'd never seemed to achieve anything meaningful, had actually been serving his country with distinction and honor while she'd been embarrassing him with questions about why he couldn't hold down a regular job. My father sat with tears streaming down his face, his hands shaking as he processed the realization that his disappointment of a son had been protecting American lives while his golden child had been betraying American secrets. Marcus stared at the three uniformed men saluting his younger brother with an expression that mixed shock with something that looked like genuine grief, as if he was finally understanding not just the magnitude of his crimes, but the identity of the person he'd been trying to destroy through his unauthorized access to classified information. His attorney sat frozen beside him, probably realizing that her defense strategy of portraying the prosecution's case as persecution of a successful businessman had just collapsed in the face of testimony that revealed her client had been systematically attempting to compromise his own brother's safety and the security of operations that protected innocent lives. The judge had to call for order as whispers and gasps rippled through the gallery, spectators trying to process the dramatic revelation that the family failure was actually a decorated special operations veteran, while the successful businessman was facing serious federal charges for betraying the country his brother had served with such distinction. The contrast was so stark, so completely opposite to what everyone had assumed about the two brothers, that it seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about success and failure, about public achievement and private service. When court recessed for deliberation, I finally had the opportunity to speak with my parents outside the formal structure of legal proceedings, to answer questions they'd been accumulating for years about my absences and evasions, my reluctance to discuss my work, and my apparent inability to maintain what they considered normal employment. My mother held my hands while she apologized for every worry she'd expressed about my future, every suggestion that I needed to get my life together and find direction. Every moment when she'd compared me unfavorably to Marcus and wondered where she'd gone wrong in raising me. My father struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between 8 years of assumptions and the reality of who I actually was, between his pride in the son he'd thought was successful and his shock at learning that the son he'd worried about had been achieving things that went far beyond anything he'd imagined possible. He kept shaking his head and repeating that he should have known, that there should have been signs that I was involved in something important and meaningful rather than drifting through temporary jobs and uncertain prospects. The hardest conversation was with Marcus himself, when his attorney finally allowed us a few minutes together in a conference room where we could speak privately about everything that had been revealed during the trial. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by the weight of understanding how completely he'd misunderstood both his own situation and his brother's identity, how his pursuit of classified information had targeted the very person whose safety and success he should have been protecting rather than undermining. He apologized with the kind of broken sincerity that comes from someone who's finally grasped the magnitude of their mistakes, who understands that their actions had consequences extending far beyond their own legal troubles to endanger people they claimed to love. He talked about how his competitiveness and need for recognition had clouded his judgment, how his pursuit of information and influence had led him to betray principles and people that should have been sacred to someone who claimed to love his country and his family. The jury returned their verdict after less than 3 hours of deliberation, finding Marcus guilty on all charges related to unauthorized access to classified information and sharing restricted material with foreign contacts. The evidence had been too comprehensive and the testimony too compelling for any other outcome. The case built too methodically for reasonable doubt to exist about his intentions or the scope of his criminal activities. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged the complexity of a case where family relationships had been entangled with matters of national security, where personal betrayal had intersected with professional obligations in ways that created lasting damage to both institutional trust and intimate connections. She imposed a sentence that reflected the seriousness of his crimes while acknowledging his cooperation during the investigation and his apparent genuine remorse for actions that had endangered operations and personnel he'd never intended to harm. The months that followed were difficult for our entire family as we learned to rebuild relationships around new understandings of who we actually were rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. My parents struggled with guilt about their years of worry and disappointment, their inability to see that their concerns about my future had been misplaced because they'd been operating with incomplete information about what my present actually involved. Marcus served his sentence with the dignity of someone who'd finally understood the true cost of his actions, using his time in federal prison to reflect on how his pursuit of recognition and financial gain had led him to betray everything he'd claimed to value. When he was released, he found a different world waiting for him, one where his reputation and professional prospects had been permanently altered by his conviction, but also one where his relationship with his family had been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than assumptions and misunderstandings. The most profound change was in how my parents saw both of their sons, their understanding that success and failure couldn't be measured only by visible achievements and public recognition, that some of the most important work in the world happened in silence and required sacrifices that could never be acknowledged or celebrated in traditional ways. They learned to be proud of service that couldn't be discussed at dinner parties, of achievements that would never appear in alumni magazines or family Christmas letters. For my part, I learned that keeping secrets from family members who loved me had protected more than operational security. It had also protected them from worrying about dangers they couldn't control or understand. But I also learned that those secrets had created distance and misunderstanding that caused its own kind of damage, that my willingness to accept their disappointment had been a form of sacrifice that went beyond what my service actually required. The vindication I'd experienced in that courtroom wasn't just about Marcus's recognition of my true identity or my parents' understanding of my actual achievements. It was about the possibility of building relationships based on truth rather than carefully constructed lies, about finding ways to honor both my obligations to national security and my connections to people whose love and respect mattered more than any recognition I could receive from strangers. Years later, when I think about that morning in the courthouse when everything changed, I don't remember it as a moment of triumph over the brother who'd underestimated and betrayed me, but as the beginning of a more honest way of living that allowed me to serve my country without completely sacrificing my connections to the people who'd shaped me into someone worthy of the trust that classified service requires. The salute that those 3 uniformed men had given me was important, but the tears in my parents' eyes when they finally understood who I really was meant more than any recognition I'd ever received from commanding officers or government officials. The truth had set us all free, even if that freedom came with the knowledge that some forms of service require sacrifices that can never be fully understood by people who haven't made them themselves, and that sometimes the greatest honor comes not from public recognition, but from the quiet knowledge that you've protected people and principles that matter more than your own comfort or reputation. They called me the family disappointment, The one who'd never amount to anything, the brother who drifted from job to job while everyone else built careers and raised families. But that day in the courtroom when those green berets stood at attention and saluted me, when their commanding officer looked directly at my golden boy brother and called him the real threat to national security, everything changed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the polished courthouse floors. And I could feel my mother's confused stare burning into the side of my face as she tried to understand why these decorated soldiers were showing me the kind of respect she'd never seen anyone give me before. The air conditioning hummed with that particular courthouse chill that seeps into your bones and stays there, making everyone fidget in their stiff formal clothes, but I sat perfectly still. My hands folded in my lap the way I'd learned to do during countless briefings in places my family would never know about. Before I tell you the story, I need to know you're here with me on this journey. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing how far these stories reach, because what happened to me that day changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. My family had always been clear about the hierarchy. There was Marcus, my older brother, the investment banker with the corner office and the house in the suburbs, the one who drove our parents to every holiday dinner in his BMW and paid for family vacations without blinking. There was Sarah, my sister, the pediatrician who saved children's lives and made our mother cry with pride every time someone mentioned her work at the hospital. And then there was me, 32 years old and still figuring things out, or so they thought. I was the one who showed up to family gatherings in jeans while everyone else wore business casual, the one who never seemed to hold down a job for more than a few months, the one who disappeared for weeks at a time without much explanation. They'd given up asking where I went during those long absences, probably assuming I was couch surfing or working odd jobs to make rent on whatever small apartment I was calling home that month. The thing about being the family disappointment is that people stop expecting explanations from you after a while. When I'd miss Christmas dinner, my mother would sigh and say she hoped I was staying warm somewhere. When I'd show up to birthday parties with stubble and tired eyes, they'd exchange those looks that said everything they were too polite to speak out loud. Marcus would clap me on the shoulder with that mixture of pity and superiority that successful older brothers perfect over time, asking if I needed money or job connections in that tone that suggested he already knew I'd waste both. Sarah would hug me tight and whisper that she was worried about me, her medical training probably cataloging the weight I'd lost or the new scars I couldn't quite explain away. The truth was, I'd stopped trying to explain myself years ago. How do you tell your family that you can't talk about where you've been or what you've been doing without sounding like you're making excuses for another stint of unemployment? How do you sit at a dinner table discussing stock portfolios and school board meetings when your mind is still processing classified briefings and mission debriefs that you'll never be allowed to share with anyone, especially not the people who share your DNA? It became easier to let them believe their version of my story, to nod along when they talked about me like I was a cautionary tale, to accept the role of the brother who just couldn't get his life together. Marcus had always been the golden child, even before he started making the kind of money that impressed our parents' country club friends. He was the one who graduated summa cum laude, who got into the prestigious MBA program, who married his college sweetheart in a ceremony that looked like something from a magazine. He was the one our father bragged about at work, the son who validated every sacrifice our parents had made to send us to good schools and give us opportunities they'd never had. When Marcus bought his first house, Dad spent the entire housewarming party giving tours to anyone who'd listen, pointing out the crown molding and granite countertops like he'd installed them himself. I understood why they were proud of him. Marcus had followed the path they could understand, had achieved success in ways they could measure and brag about to their friends. He sent flowers on Mother's Day and remembered anniversaries, took care of their taxes, and helped them navigate Medicare changes as they got older. He was reliable, present, and most importantly, he could explain what he did for a living in terms that made sense at cocktail parties. When people asked about their children, our parents could talk about Marcus's latest promotion or the vacation he'd taken the family on, concrete achievements that proved they'd raised him right. But even golden children can have shadows, and Marcus's shadow was something our family had spent years learning not to discuss. He'd always been competitive, sometimes ruthlessly so, but somewhere along the way that competitiveness had curdled into something harder to ignore. There were the rumors about how he'd gotten his first big promotion, whispers about clients who'd trusted him with information they later regretted sharing. There were the arguments with colleagues that seemed to escalate beyond normal workplace friction, the pattern of people who'd once considered him a friend gradually distancing themselves from his orbit. Our parents explained away these incidents as jealousy, as lesser people who couldn't handle Marcus's success or ambition. They'd shake their heads and talk about how difficult it was to be exceptional in a world full of mediocrity, how people would always try to tear down someone who was achieving greatness. When former friends stopped calling or colleagues requested transfers away from his department, they attributed it to office politics and the cutthroat nature of high finance. They never asked the questions that might have led to uncomfortable answers, never wondered if maybe the common denominator in all these conflicts was Marcus himself. I'd seen glimpses of that darker side over the years, moments when the charm would slip and something colder would show through. The way he'd smile when talking about a rival's failure, the casual cruelty he'd deploy when someone disagreed with him, the methodical way he'd gather information about people that seemed to go beyond normal curiosity. But these observations came from someone the family had already written off as unreliable, someone whose perspective on anything, especially successful Marcus, was automatically suspect. The legal trouble had started 6 months before the trial, though our family didn't learn about it until much later. Marcus had been doing consulting work for a defense contractor, something that had seemed like a natural extension of his financial expertise into a more prestigious and lucrative sector. He'd been excited about the clearance process, had talked about how his background check had gone smoothly, and how impressed his new employers were with his analytical skills. What none of us knew at the time was that those analytical skills had been turned toward information that wasn't his to analyze, that his methodical nature had led him to access classified materials that went far beyond his authorization level. The first sign that something was wrong came when Marcus started canceling family dinners, claiming he was too busy with the new project to make time for what he called our routine gatherings. This wasn't entirely unusual for him during busy periods, but there was something different about his demeanor when we did see him. He seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone and computer, answering questions with the kind of vague responses that suggested his mind was elsewhere. When Mom would ask about his work, he'd launch into elaborate explanations about financial modeling and risk assessment that seemed designed more to fill time than to actually communicate anything meaningful. The second sign was when he started asking questions about my own work history, casual inquiries that felt less like brotherly interest and more like an interview. He wanted to know about the companies I'd supposedly worked for, the gaps in my resume that I'd never adequately explained, the references I'd listed on job applications that never seemed to check out when people tried to verify them. At the time, I'd assumed he was genuinely trying to help me get my life together, maybe planning to offer me a job or connect me with someone in his network who could give me a real career opportunity. Looking back, I realize he was fishing for information, trying to piece together the parts of my life that didn't add up to the story our family had constructed about my failures and false starts. Marcus had always been good at reading people and situations, at finding the inconsistencies and leverage points that could be useful later. He'd built his career on that skill, on being able to see patterns and connections that others missed, and he'd turned that analytical mind toward his own brother without any of us realizing what he was doing. The third sign was when the background investigators started showing up at our parents' house, asking questions about both of their sons and wanting to verify information that Marcus had provided during his security clearance review. They were professional and polite, but their questions revealed that someone had been less than truthful about family connections and personal history. Our parents were confused and worried, calling both of us to ask if we knew why government agents were interested in our family, if there was something they should know about either of our careers that might explain the unexpected scrutiny. I knew exactly why they were asking questions, but I couldn't explain it without revealing information that would compromise more than just my own cover. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed genuinely surprised by the investigation, which should have been our first clue that he'd gotten himself involved in something he didn't fully understand. He'd always been confident in his ability to navigate complex systems and bureaucracies. But the world of classified information and national security operates by rules that don't bend for clever financial analysts who think they can outsmart protocols that exist for reasons beyond their comprehension. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning in November, federal agents arriving at Marcus's office with warrants and handcuffs while his colleagues watched in stunned silence. The charges were serious enough to make the local news: corporate espionage and unauthorized access to classified materials, the kind of accusations that end careers and freedoms in equal measure. Our parents got the call from Marcus's lawyer before they heard it on television, a small mercy that probably prevented our mother from collapsing in the grocery store or our father from having a heart attack while reading the morning paper. The family meeting that followed was unlike anything we'd ever experienced, our parents trying to process how their golden child had gone from corner office to county jail in a single morning. Marcus maintained his innocence, of course, claiming that he'd been set up by jealous colleagues or that there had been some misunderstanding about his access permissions. He hired the best defense attorney money could buy, a sharp woman who specialized in white-collar federal cases and who seemed confident that she could create reasonable doubt about his intentions and level of culpability. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been briefed about his activities months before his arrest. That I'd sat in secure conference rooms while analysts explained how someone with his background and access had been systematically copying and analyzing classified documents that had nothing to do with his legitimate work responsibilities. I'd listened to recordings of phone calls where he discussed information he shouldn't have possessed with people who had no business hearing it, watched surveillance footage of him accessing systems and files that were completely outside his area of authorization. The hardest part wasn't learning that my brother was a criminal, though that was painful enough. The hardest part was sitting at that family meeting, listening to him construct elaborate explanations for his behavior while our parents nodded along and offered their support. Knowing that I couldn't reveal what I knew without compromising ongoing investigations and endangering people whose lives depended on that information staying classified. I had to watch our mother cry and our father age 10 years in 10 minutes, while the brother I'd grown up with, the golden child who'd never done anything wrong in their eyes, spun lies about misunderstandings and persecution with the same confidence he'd once used to explain market fluctuations and investment strategies. The trial date was set for the following spring, giving Marcus's attorney time to prepare a defense and our family time to adjust to a new reality where their successful son was facing serious federal charges. They rallied around him with the same loyalty they'd always shown, mortgaging their house to help pay for his legal fees and attending every hearing to show their support. They talked about him like he was the victim of an overzealous prosecution. A talented man whose intelligence had been misconstrued as malicious intent by investigators who didn't understand the complex world of defense contracting and financial analysis. I wanted to tell them the truth, to explain that their faith was misplaced and their sacrifices were being made for someone who'd betrayed more than just classified information. But operational security isn't something you can set aside for family comfort, and there were larger concerns at play than our parents' peace of mind or even Marcus's freedom. The case against him was solid, built on evidence that would speak for itself once it was presented in court. And my role was to remain silent until the right moment came to reveal information that could be shared without compromising ongoing operations or putting other people at risk. As we walked up the courthouse steps that morning, 6 months after his arrest and years after his crimes had actually begun, I could feel the weight of everything I knew pressing against my chest like a physical force. Marcus walked beside our parents with the confident stride of someone who still believed he could talk his way out of consequences, his expensive suit and polished shoes reflecting his certainty that intelligence and charm would triumph over whatever evidence the prosecution thought they had assembled against him. Our mother held our father's arm for support, both of them looking older and more fragile than they had just months before. The stress of defending their son's reputation and managing the financial burden of his legal defense etched into the lines around their eyes and the set of their shoulders. They'd aged years and months, their faith in Marcus never wavering even as the evidence mounted and the reality of his situation became increasingly clear to everyone except the people who loved him most. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the usual mixture of anxiety and determination that surrounds federal criminal proceedings, lawyers wheeling cases full of documents while defendants and their families clustered in nervous groups, speaking in hushed tones about plea bargains and sentencing guidelines. We found seats on a bench near the elevator, our small family group attracting sympathetic glances from other people who recognized the particular strain that comes with defending someone you love against charges you don't fully understand. Marcus's attorney arrived precisely on time, her heels clicking across the marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd walked these halls countless times before. She nodded to our parents and exchanged quiet words with Marcus about strategy and expectations, reminding him to remain calm and let her handle all communication with the prosecution and judge. She seemed genuinely optimistic about their chances, or at least skilled enough at her job to project optimism for the benefit of her client and his family. What none of them knew, as we rode the elevator to the courtroom where Marcus's fate would be decided, was that I wouldn't be sitting in the gallery with the rest of the family. What they didn't understand was that my name was on the prosecution's witness list, that the months of silence and careful distance I'd maintained weren't signs of my usual unreliability, but necessary preparation for a moment that was about to change everything they thought they knew about both of their sons.